The next 2 DVDs are based entirely on techniques from the first 4 volumes. If you haven't watched volumes 1 through 4, it's crucial that you do so first. On the last 2 volumes, we'll first look at techniques for staging scenes and then do a lot of script stagings. If you prefer to have printed scripts and blocking diagrams in addition to the animations, you can download them in PDF format at hollywoodcamerawork.us/downloads.html. By now it's clear that the type of blocking we're working with in this course can't be improvised on the set, but has to be planned. To do that, we need a system for blocking on paper. Here we'll propose a system that's extremely easy to draw, either freehand or with a template that can draw circles and triangles, which is available at most office stores. We're usually starting with the layout of the set, which we either get from the production designer or from a sketch of the location. We'll illustrate characters as circles. Here we'll create 2 characters and give them each a color. Since colors are harder to erase, it makes sense to not add the colors before we're sure of the characters' positions. To illustrate which way they're facing, we'll draw a line inside the circle. In this course, we have men and women of the same colors, so to avoid confusion, we'll illustrate the women with an extra line. We'll illustrate cameras as 2 sides of a triangle, showing the rough angle the camera is shooting. If this isn't over the shoulder, we'll add a matching reverse here. Next, we'll have the blue woman turn away from the red man. To show that, we'll simply draw another face inside the circle and an arrow to show the turn. To show character movement, we'll simply draw another circle in the new location and an arrow to show the movement. The arrow can be any color. Here we're drawing it the same color as the character for clarity. Drawing a separate character for each stop is the same as we did on Volume 2, and it makes managing the line phenomenally easier. To show tracking shots, we'll draw another camera over here and connect them with a line. We'll draw an arrow to show the direction of the track. This camera now starts in and over the shoulder and pulls ahead of her as she walks. We'll additionally add small dots to show each of the stops on the track. This is useful because if we have complicated panning while tracking, we might want to draw that as extra cameras on the track that function as guides instead of stops. Next, we'll have the man walk over here, so we'll again draw another circle and a line to show the walk. To cover that, we'll have the tracking camera pivot on the woman. The ending keyframe will be here, so we'll draw another camera on the track and add a dot for the stop. To show the move, we'll first of all draw a small arrow for the reuse of the track. Second, we'll write PIV for pivot. For very simple tracks, an arrow or 2 is enough to remember the order we need to track between the keyframes in, but for very complicated tracks, it usually works better to write numbers by each stop. If we then return to the diagram in a month or 2, we can quickly get a picture of what we meant. Here's then what this test scene looks like. We start by cutting the dialogue between the characters. The key to blocking like this is that we're not trying to create a mathematically correct diagram or even a rigid plan that we have to follow to the letter. The plan just needs to be close enough, and we can make the final tweaks on the set or discover things we hadn't thought of. Here we reframe as the woman turns away from the man. As she walks, we pull ahead of her, trying to keep the man in the frame. Arriving by a small table. As the man walks to a second mark, we reuse the track for the pivot. Next, we'll look at illustrating panning, tilting, and booming. In this scene, the blue man walks over to the red man. To show a pan, we'll just draw the ending keyframe and an arrow into it, which is usually obvious enough to imply that there's a previous keyframe with the camera facing more to the left. For more specific pans, we can also draw each keyframe, but we naturally want to avoid drawing too many cameras on top of each other. Next, the red man walks past the red woman who's sitting in a chair. We want to move with him and hand off to the woman, ending in this keyframe, so we'll lay a track between the 2 extremes. Add an arrow to show the movement, and 2 dots to show the stops. But because she's sitting in a chair, we'll want to be low at the end. To illustrate the boom action, we'll write the elevation of the camera at each stop. So behind the first location, we write up, and behind the second, we'll write DN for down. We'll show tilting up and down as an arrow in front of the camera. To tilt down, we'll show an arrow going into the camera. A good analogy is to see it as tilting towards the feet. To tilt up, we'll show an arrow going out and up. To tilt both up and down, we'll draw an arrow going both ways. To use this, let's have the blue man walk over to the woman. As he arrives, we want to tilt up, so we'll draw an arrow away from the camera. At the end, the blue man walks away, and we tilt down again, so we'll add another arrowhead pointing towards the camera. Let's first look at the camera movement. We start by panning into the first dialogue. Again, we'll just let the written blocking be close enough and make the final adjustments on the set. Here as the man walks, the diagram says to crane down during the track, but in reality we'll stay level with him for the first half, and then begin craning down halfway through the move. As the blue man steps in, we tilt up. As he leaves, we tilt down and end the scene on the woman. Since the track and dolly are the hardest to move around, we'll set up the shot so it's about right and then tweak the character's marks and even rearrange the set to perfect the framing. As we track with the red man and hand off to the woman, we might have found on our first run-through that the framing wasn't completely right. At this point, it's much easier to move her than it is to move the track. The blue man steps in and we tilt up. He leaves and we tilt down to end on the woman. The last thing we'll look at is how to illustrate many things happening in the same spot, starting with characters changing elevation. In this scene, the red character is sitting behind a table and the blue character is standing. So we'll put in two reverses. This one is low because the red character is sitting, and this one is high because the blue character is standing. But we don't need to write that because we can just as well make that decision on the set. If the red character stands up, we'll simply make a note that he stands up, which implies that he's sitting down before that. If the reverse on him tilts up with him, we would just draw an arrow out and up. But if we're booming up, we have two elevations in the same spot. So by writing both elevations as down up, we'll know to start down and then boom up. Another thing that can be hard to write down is when characters reuse each other's stops, which is a very effective way to save cameras because we don't need any new coverage. Here the blue man walks over to the gray man and we'll set up two reverses. But when he walks out, the red man walks over where he stood so we can use the same cameras. No matter which way we draw this, if we return to it in a month, we'll need a moment to understand what we meant. So let's simply draw a dot in the middle of the character to remember that it's a dual-use stop and leave it in the color of the first character standing there. We also need a way to write down doing several versions of a take. In a typical situation, we've set up an over-the-shoulder to do a slow push during the dialogue. If we want to cut wide again after the push, we'll need a full lock take from the wide position. So we'll write L for locked by that keyframe. If we wanted a lock close shot as well, we write L by the close keyframe. We then have 3 takes, 2 locked and 1 that tracks. Sometimes a lock take needs to have very different behavior than the tracking version. Before the main dialogue, let's say that the red character walks in and we want to boom up from his feet while panning into the over-the-shoulder. We'd write this as both down up and an arrow for the pan. But if this is only meant for the locked version, it can get confusing, and we're better off drawing it as a separate camera nearby the original keyframe. Even though we'll physically shoot it with the same camera on the same track, this way makes it easier for us to remember what we meant when we drew it. If you use Adobe Illustrator, you can download our template for creating blocking diagrams on the computer instead of on paper. To download, go to hollywoodcamerawork.us/downloads.html. In this chapter, we'll create a checklist, or a way to attack scenes, which produces great results for the vast majority of scenes. Let's start by listing the steps and then go over them in more detail, starting with finding stops and movement, finding moves and transitions, finding keyframes and deep staging, finding coverage, connecting keyframes, finding lead-ins and extensions, and coordinating foreground and background. This method is best for scenes that lend themselves to being covered in parallel and from several angles at once. If we're blocking a very sequential scene, for example a chase, we're better off with a more storyboarded approach and covering each bit of action as a separate shot. A crucial point regarding this checklist is that we're really doing all steps at the same time, each with an eye for the others, and not necessarily in order. The only exception is maybe the first step, which is finding stops and movement, because finding the basic action is usually the best place to start. In this scene, we'll assume that the script provides some hints about character positioning, first that the red woman and the gray man are having a conversation over a table. and that the red man is somewhere in the background. Besides that, we're on our own, which is where the motivations for character movement we looked at on Volume 2 become extremely useful. Let's say that the situation is very confrontational because the gray man is selling out on his partners. The subtext of the scene is that he's doing it because he's being blackmailed, so we want some shots where we get a private view of his facial expression to show his troubled feelings. We could do that by creating a stop where he walks over here, facing away, which we would cover in a camera facing this way. After the conversation is continued here, the red woman charges over to get a straight answer. He then turns to her, and after a bit of conversation she walks out, which was the only other stage direction that was obvious in the script or that we decided to keep. Putting this diagram on hold for a moment, it's worth placing characters with an eye on how we want to shoot them. This becomes especially important if we want to create moves that pass by characters just in time for their line. Here the characters have consecutive lines, and it's not particularly important where we place them, so we'll arrange them by their order. We'll be tracking this way, so starting with the blue man, he walks this way, to the red woman, who begins walking, past the red man, who we hand off to, and continue tracking, resulting in a pivot reveal of the blue woman in the background. Here we've put in the camera and track immediately, but even if we didn't, arranging the characters like this would make that very easy later on. This very simple strategy creates an enormously complex move. We track with the blue man, past the red woman who takes over his movement, hand off to the red man, and pivot reveal the blue woman. There's probably no way we could happen upon a move like this without deliberately arranging the characters for it. Finding moves and transitions often follows immediately after. These are moves that need to be in a particular place at a particular time, so we might as well build them into the central structure of the scene. In an example on Volume 3, the man was standing next to the woman and then walked over to sit in a chair opposite her. The move we wanted tracked from one over the shoulder to another, so we put that in first, and built the scene around it by adding 2 reverses. These moves could just as easily come about as a consequence of connecting keyframes, but that's usually not how we get the idea. So it makes sense to simply put them in. Transitions are meant for shots that tell a specific story and that we can't leave to chance. Here the red man walks past the blue man, and it would serve the story with a camera that hands off, so we'll put one in very early. Whatever else happens in the scene, we're sure to get this shot, and to integrate it, we'll simply find something to use it for before and after. Maybe having this camera be a lock shot on the red man before the handoff. Another transition could be a pivot reveal, which is again an extremely specific move that needs to go in early. As we push in on the red man and pivot reveal the blue woman, the camera is now reverse shot and we can weave it into the scene by adding a matching one here. We could expand on that by having the woman arrive as the reveal happens, but the point is that we put the move in first and then work forwards and backwards in time to give the camera more function. Other very specific moves are basing a scene on a particular technique. In this scene, the woman is sitting by a table and the man walks back and forth, which we want to cover in one continuous pivoting camera. For the man's first stop, the dolly is here. For the second, it's here. For the third, it's here. And for the fourth, it's here. This camera is now a central part of the scene, and all other cameras go in according to that. Returning to the diagram we were working on, let's say that we've imagined one particular move, which is a close push on the gray man as the woman walks out. We'll start it in what will be an over-the-shoulder before the move, becoming a close-up after the push, and we've now locked the move right into the scene. Moving on to finding keyframes and deep staging, this is one of the most important techniques in this course. Our purpose now is to simply place as many keyframes as we can think of for all the shots and angles we might want to be in at some point. The key is that we're placing virtual cameras as placeholders and then first later decide which ones to connect on tracks. In the first part of the dialogue around the table, we could easily want a pair of over-the-shoulders. A pair of close-ups would also come naturally. To get the red man in the background into the scene, let's create a deep staging shot with a woman in the foreground. For the gray man facing away, let's create the personal shot with him in the foreground. But as we put in keyframes, we're beginning to tie down the blocking. This is fine for most types of shots, except the more complicated deep staging shots, which are often created by deliberately arranging characters for the camera. So let's use this last opportunity to rearrange the characters by moving the gray man's stop over here, which will create an elegant staggered deep staging shot as he steps away. But moving him, of course, means that the woman's stop has to change as well. With that done, we'll place a keyframe here, which is a staggered deep staging shot as long as the woman is by the table. For the sake of this chapter, let's delete the close push on the gray man because we have another opportunity to create one later on that we also need to look at. So for now, as she walks over to the gray man on his new mark, let's simply place a reverse pair. Finding coverage is an extension of placing keyframes and is simply about adding detail to the coverage by looking for inserts and close-ups. This is a very simple scene, and we already have the close-ups we need, so there's not a lot to find. But we could place an insert on a document on the table, which is an active prop in the scene. We could also place a close-up on the red man and see if we end up using it. This step could be considered a moot point, but getting detail is easy to forget, which is why it's on the list. Connecting keyframes is the payoff to placing virtual cameras for all the places we would want to be. The goal now is to find interesting ways to connect these keyframes on track. We could, for example, connect the close-up on the red man with a deep staging shot with a woman in the foreground, which would create a start-on reveal. We could maybe connect each of the over-the-shoulders and close-ups by the table and start pushing both cameras during the dialogue. But every time we make these connections, we preclude other connections. Now we wouldn't be able to connect this deep staging shot with this close-up because each of the keyframes are already used on tracks at different angles. It also wouldn't be a very interesting move. Over by the second position, we could do a very effective move though. Starting in the staggered deep staging shot, we could track into this over the shoulder as the woman walks over, resulting in a pivot. This move is easy because we don't need the over the shoulder before she's walked over, and we don't need the staggered deep staging shot after. But if we did, we would simply put in else to get lock versions as well. Moving on to finding lead-ins and extensions, this is a step that produces a lot of production value very quickly. With what we've laid down now, let's look for additions to make before and after the main business for each camera. First, let's add a big piece of action to the beginning of the scene by having the red man start by a table over here and then walk to his first real mark. We'll cover that starting in a keyframe here. And let's connect that to this deep staging shot, resulting in a move that starts away and tracks into a very deliberate framing. This will also produce a lot of parallax towards the end of the move as we track behind the red woman because the keyframes are on opposite sides of the line. Actually, let's add another lead-in by starting on the papers, then tilt up on the red man, and then track into the first real keyframe. At the end of the scene, let's recreate the close push on the gray man, this time as an extension, which is usually the better way to create a close push. So far, this camera has just been a locked reverse, but as the woman leaves, let's extend this camera by pushing in. We'll additionally have the woman leave in this direction instead to get more movement in the foreground. A final little thing we could do is by this camera, which is the over-the-shoulder on the gray man when they're by the table. Let's pan it as he walks away to get that covered. For this part of the scene, we can then cut between this camera, the staggered deep staging shot, and the tighter deep staging shot, which will allow us to cut fairly rich dialogue. The last step, which is again really done at any time during blocking, is coordinating foreground and background. Many foreground decisions can of course easily be made on the set, but the more we prepare, the easier it will be to give useful direction on the set. For the move in the beginning of the scene, we're tracking through a section of empty space, so this would be a good place to put in some foreground, maybe an extra. Coordinating background is more about decorating the framing by rearranging the set or placing extras and gaps in the frame. We have plenty of deep staging over here, but let's put in an extra in the background of this shot for one we have tilted up to create more depth. Before we go ahead and shoot it, one thing we might want to do is clean up by removing keyframes that ended up not serving a purpose. This is a short scene and we have plenty of coverage, so the close-up on the red man is maybe overkill. We can leave it in there and drop it if we go over time on the set, but let's just get rid of it permanently. The end result is a scene with 8 cameras, 5 locked and 3 of them tracking. It looks a little confusing when all the cameras are slapped on top of each other, but when we look at each of the cameras, their individual actions are fairly simple. The first camera we'll look at is the one that opens the scene. This camera started as simply a deep staging keyframe over by the woman, and everything we're doing in the beginning is a lead-in. Starting on the paper, up on the man with the extra in the background, and tracking over to the main keyframe, passing behind the other extra to get more parallax. Here the camera is simply a locked shot. After the man in the suit has walked away to be more private, the woman walks over as well. At some point, she would have to walk through the camera, which is where we'll cut. The lock cameras are simply reverses in two sizes and an insert on a piece of paper on the table. These will be easy to shoot, so let's move on to the only one of the cameras that has action, which is the over-the-shoulder on the man in the suit. As he walks away, we're panning with him to make sure we have that action covered. From this camera, we're probably cutting to the staggered deep staging shot, so let's look at that now. This camera is really just supposed to be locked in the deep staging shot until the woman walks over, at which point it pivots. But since we're cutting from a panning camera, let's also be moving in this camera to get a smoother cut. We'll do that by creating another lead-in. We'll create a prior keyframe with the track a little further to the left so that when the man walks over, we nudge slightly into the deep staging shot, almost like a timed master move. When the woman walks over, we pivot to follow her, ending in an over-the-shoulder that's useful for the remainder of the scene. The last camera is the matching reverse that could have been locked, but that we put on a track to do a close push as an extension at the end. So for the major part of this section, it's locked. And when the woman leaves, this time in front of the camera, we push in for reaction. In the following script stagings, we'll also look at the takes for each camera, but since this scene is just a demo, let's cut it together right away. So starting in the lead-in, we tilt up from the papers, then track with the man, behind the extra, ending in the smaller deep staging shot. An unexpected byproduct of the extra we place for parallax is that she also becomes part of a staggered deep staging shot here. Here we simply cut between the lock cameras, some of which are close-ups. If we want to bring the red men back into the scene, we still have this camera locked on a track. The man in the suit walks away and we pan this over the shoulder and cut to what will become a staggered deep staging shot here. Here we'll cut dialogue between this camera, the closer deep staging shot, and the reverse, which is shooting the man from the back. Back in the staggered shot, the woman charges over and we pivot into an over-the-shoulder. The man turns to her and we continue the dialogue with the reverse, which is on a track for the close push coming up. The woman walks out, and we push in on the man for reaction. For the remaining part of the course, we'll now stage scenes to put everything together. The first two scenes we'll work with take place aboard a starship and are made to resemble a Star Trek-type scenario. In this story, Captain Bradley, the Red Woman, was investigating a mysterious dark cloud that caused the death of a crew member, but was quickly ordered to assist in some boring and pointless negotiations, which she found very strange. In this scene, the captain is receiving a call from a colonel and is glad to be interrupted. The red man, Jeremy, is second in command, and the blue man outside the door is a guard ordered to prevent anyone from communicating outside the negotiating room. Let's do a read-through. On monitor, Colonel Stephen Boutel, an aging officer speaking from behind a desk. The transmission occasionally breaks up.
No matter what we try, we're not getting through. It might just be the atmosphere, but I think we're being blocked.
Pulling out from the monitor, we're in a small crew quarter. Jeremy picks up archaeological artifacts while he waits. A guard stands watch outside the door.
Have you tracked down the cause of the explosion?
It's inconclusive, but we also have a survey team missing below the planet's surface. I don't think this is a coincidence.
Colonel, we can be at your position in less than a day.
Are you trying to get out of those negotiations?
Of course not.
Anyway, you're not equipped for this sector. We are having some problems.
What kind of problems?
A strange phenomenon. This whole sector is engulfed in some sort of blackout. It's like the space just absorbs energy.
Bradley and Jeremy become puzzled.
We're using 35% of ship's power just for this transmission. Anyway, we need those logs.
We'll send them. Good to hear from you again.
Likewise. Patel out.
The screen returns to a logo. Jeremy has walked over to the captain's desk. Bradley gets up.
Send them the logs.
Jeremy acknowledges.
Overman,
Sir?
report to the mediator that I won't be able to attend the remaining negotiations. Urgent matters.
Sir?
Carry on, that's an order.
The guard looks mystified, then leaves. Jeremy walks over to Bradley.
Sir?
How soon can we end this without ticking off the delegates? I want to stop by Sector 481 on our way to Rana 4.
They are in different directions, sir.
You don't say.
I'll make the necessary preparations.
Jeremy leaves. Bradley ponders her next move, then walks out. In this scene, we're starting with the diagram of the set. The gray box here is the desk where the captain will sit, and the black line is the monitor where the colonel's transmission is shown. Bradley sits in the chair by the monitor. The gray square to the left is a table with artifacts which Jeremy will examine as he waits for the captain, so we'll place him here. That table could be anywhere, but we've put it here so Jeremy can be away from the captain's conversation and then walk over when it ends. The guard is outside the door for most of the scene. We'll probably have shots on both Jeremy and the captain, so we'll try to keep him in the background to help the spatial continuity. When Bradley is done with her conversation with the colonel, Jeremy walks over. Bradley stands up, then calls for the guard who walks into the room. She walks over to meet him. After a brief conversation, she dismisses the guard who leaves. Jeremy then walks over. We've placed the characters like this because we have an idea of being in a right-angle master as the captain talks to the guard. And when he leaves, reframe into an over-the-shoulder for the dialogue with Jeremy. After their conversation here, Jeremy walks out. The captain stands for a moment to collect herself, then walks out as well. In this scene, there's some specific moves we want to get, but we'll generally cover it by first picking all the keyframes we want to be in, and then later deciding which ones to connect on track and which ones to leave as lock cameras. We'll probably want a wide shot or a master here. For the first half of the scene, this keyframe will cover the captain with a guard in the background. When Jeremy walks over, we would need a wider shot, so we'll place a wider keyframe here. This creates a line here, and all cameras for the first half of the scene need to be on this side of it. We'll also need a close-up on the monitor for the colonel, as well as a close-up on the captain. The script says that we're pulling out from the monitor, so we can either pull out into the wide keyframe, or we could track around from the monitor to the close-up on the captain, which could also be a good move. In each case, we would need to do a full lock take on the monitor as well for the colonel. When Jeremy is by the artifacts, we'll place a keyframe here. Like the wide masters, this keyframe has the guard in the background for spatial continuity. As Jeremy waits for the captain to finish the call, he picks up artifacts on the table. We'll shift up and down with his hand, so we'll put in both a pan arrow and a tilt arrow. When Jeremy walks to the captain, we could connect this keyframe with one of the wide masters and track with him as he walks. But for now, we just want to find out where we need to be. Let's prepare for a couple of specific moves we've imagined. During the captain's conversation with the colonel in the first half of the scene, there's an important beat as the colonel begins talking about a mysterious blackout. This is very puzzling to both the captain and Jeremy, and we want to do slow, close pushes on them both. For Jeremy, we'll put in a closer keyframe ready to be connected with track. Over by the captain, we'll want to push her close-up as well. This keyframe is already as close as it can get, so we'll put in a keyframe for the beginning. Another move we've imagined is that because Jeremy walks over to the captain just when the communication ends, we could create a transition from the monitor up on him. We already have the close-up on the monitor, so we could simply tilt up. But this would be a very steep tilt, so let's instead create a keyframe a little further back with an arrow to mark the tilt up. This keyframe will additionally have Jeremy in the background for the first half of the scene, which again helps the spatial continuity. The captain now stands up and calls for the guard. Here we've imagined another move. In a camera position right about here, we'd like to boom up with the captain and then track with her over to the dialogue by the door. But the starting keyframe is already supposed to be part of the close push on the captain. Here we would need either seriously bent track or a crab dolly. But apart from that, the push we want to do ends in this closer keyframe, so we'd have to do a separate take to track with the captain in the other direction. Let's instead split it up. We'll plan on making the close push a separate take, starting in a new keyframe here. We would then start wide and on the right beat begin pushing. In this keyframe, we're now free to boom up with the captain, which will create a good deal of parallax from Jeremy in the foreground. Again, as we track with the captain over to the guard, we'll get good parallax as we pass behind Jeremy. This move creates a new line here, and we wouldn't be able to cut to any of these cameras. But that's okay, because we won't need to go back. As the guard walks out, Jeremy walks over, we reframe as we originally planned, and we're now in an over-the-shoulder. That moves the line over here, so we'll add a matching reverse for the remaining dialogue. So let's connect these keyframes. We've already decided to connect these keyframes for the captain's walk. We've also pretty much decided to connect these for a close push on the captain. Over by the artifacts, where Jeremy starts, we can either go with a close push, or we can track with him in one of the wide masters over here as he walks to the desk. The latter is just a walk, and we really need the push, so we'll go with the first choice. For the pullout from the monitor, we'll then connect these three keyframes and start the scene by pulling out to the first stop. As Jeremy walks over, we'll pull even wider to open the space more. We'll cover the kernel on the monitor through this lock camera, which transitions up on Jeremy as the conversation ends. So that's about it. One last thing we'll add is an extension at the very end of the scene where the captain and Jeremy have their last conversation. When Jeremy walks out, we could be in this camera, and then track around to in front of the captain for a more personal shot, after which she walks out too. Let's look at the takes. We have a total of 5 tracks and 1 lock camera. So let's go through the cameras one by one. Starting with the camera that pulls out from the monitor, we end in a shot that's wide enough for this part of the scene. Here we stay locked, and we leave this camera rolling as a cutting option. The last thing that happens in this camera is that we pull out when Jeremy walks over. Since we're tracking through the wall to get wide enough, this wall needs to be wild. From here and out, we're again locked. Since the kernel on the monitor is shot as a separate element and corner pinned in, we'll simply match the speed of the pull to the length of his line.
No matter what we try, we're not getting through. It might just be the atmosphere, but I think we're being blocked.
Have you tracked down the cause of the explosion?
It's inconclusive, but we also have a survey team missing below the planet's surface. I don't think this is a coincidence.
Colonel, we can be at your position in less than a day.
Here the dialogue goes on for a while, so we'll fast forward to the next time something happens in this camera.
Anyway, we need those logs.
We'll send them. Good to hear from you again.
Likewise. Battelle out.
Send them the logs. Overman,
Sir?
report to the mediator that I won't be able to attend the remaining negotiations. Urgent matters.
As soon as she walks, we'll be tracking in the camera behind Jeremy. That puts this camera on the wrong side of the line from here on out, so we'll cut. Jeremy has no dialogue in his close-up by the artifact, so we'll shoot it without sound. We only have to make sure to get 2 things. First, some general footage of Jeremy examining the artifacts. On a cue, which we can give verbally, we push in as he hears the colonel talk about the disturbance. He then walks out of the shot and over to the captain, which is where the take ends. Like the master on the captain, this shot has the guard in the background for spatial continuity. As Jeremy touches the artifacts, we pan and tilt with him. On our cue, Jeremy hears the colonel, and we begin pushing as Jeremy turns. Finally walking out of the frame and the take ends. For our main coverage of the kernel on the monitor, we're using this lock camera. Since the kernel is to be inserted in post and we can't see the captain's face, we'll again shoot this without sound. Let's do half a minute of the captain talking to the screen to get realistic body movement and then have Jeremy walk over. We tilt up as Jeremy arrives. From here on out, our coverage is better in the other cameras, so we'll cut. This camera is our main coverage on the captain while she's sitting. All the camera does is push in at a certain point.
Have you tracked down the cause of the explosion?
It's inconclusive, but we also have a survey team missing below the planet's surface. I don't think this is a coincidence.
Colonel, we can be at your position in less than a day.
Are you trying to get out of those negotiations?
Of course not.
Anyway, you're not equipped for the sector. We are having some problems.
What kind of problems?
A strange phenomenon. This whole sector is engulfed in some sort of blackout. It's like the space just absorbs energy. We're using 35% of ship's power just for this transmission. Anyway, we need those logs.
We'll send them. Good to hear from you again.
Likewise. Patel out.
As she stands up, the take ends. This camera is the one that booms up with the captain and tracks with her to the conversation with the guard. Even though we're not intending to use this camera for the first minute of the scene, let's shoot her entire dialogue anyway so we have an extra angle. After that, Jeremy walks over and the shot becomes an over the hip. When the captain gets up, we boom up with her, which should give us some good vertical parallax. She then calls for the guard, and we track with her as she walks over, ending in a right-angle master. When she's done talking to the guard, he leaves, and Jeremy walks over. By reframing, we're now in an over-the-shoulder. This shot is done when Jeremy walks out.
Anyway, we need those logs.
We'll send them. Good to hear from you again.
Likewise. Patel out.
Send them the logs. Overman.
Sir?
Report to the mediator that I won't be able to attend the remaining negotiations. Urgent matters.
Sir?
Carry on, that's an order.
Sir?
How soon can we end this without ticking off the delegates? I want to stop by Sector 481 on our way to Rana 4.
They are in different directions, sir.
You don't say.
I'll make the necessary preparations.
The last camera is the matching reverse for the previous camera. We're active as soon as Jeremy steps into the over-the-shoulder. Then they have their final conversation, and as Jeremy walks out, we pivot around to the front of the captain, where she gathers herself and walks out of the shot.
Sir?
How soon can we end this without ticking off the delegates? I want to stop by Sector 481 on our way to Rana 4.
They are in different directions, sir.
You don't say.
I'll make the necessary preparations.
Let's view the cut.
No matter what we try, we're not getting through. It might just be the atmosphere, but I think we're being blocked.
Have you tracked down the cause of the explosion?
It's inconclusive, but we also have a survey team missing below the planet's surface. I don't think this is a coincidence.
Colonel, we can be at your position in less than a day.
Are you trying to get out of those negotiations?
Of course not.
Anyway, you're not equipped for the sector. We are having some problems.
What kind of problems?
A strange phenomenon. This whole sector is engulfed in some sort of blackout. It's like the space just absorbs energy. We're using 35% of ship's power just for this transmission. Anyway, we need those logs.
We'll send them. Good to hear from you again.
Likewise. Patel out.
Send them the logs. Overman.
Sir?
Report to the mediator that I won't be able to attend the remaining negotiations. Urgent matters.
Sir?
Carry on, that's an order.
Sir?
How soon can we end this without ticking off the delegates? I want to stop by Sector 481 on our way to Rana 4.
They are in different directions, sir.
You don't say.
I'll make the necessary preparations.
This scene is at a later point in the story from the previous script staging. Here the characters are on the bridge of the starship as they scramble to respond to an attack by invisible ships. Let's do a read-through. Bradley and Ishida rush onto the bridge as the ship shutters.
Status.
We can't see a thing. The shots are coming from empty space. There could be more than one ship.
We lost latitude controls at the first hit and the shields are crumbling. We're sitting ducks, sir.
Any other ships nearby?
All comm energy is being absorbed by the blackout.
The ship shakes heavily.
John, prepare full-spectrum neutron shells. All bays on my mark.
But, sir, we've got nothing to aim for.
I've reconfigured the forward grid to emit a stream of axion particles. By these readings, it should light up their shields.
Do it.
Ishida pushes the final button. On the view screen, 2 warships suddenly become visible.
There they are.
Locked and ready.
Bradley steps forwards.
Fire!
A thing that could work great for this scene is to base the blocking on transitions where we try to combine as many actions and lines as possible into single shots, which can give the sequence a tight flow. This is easiest to do if we can arrange the characters at will, which in this scene will be plausible because the situation is chaotic. Captain Bradley and Ishida start outside the automatic door. The captain rushes in and asks for a status report, after which Jonathan and Jeremy each have a line. Our goal is to create a track pulling with her this way and then pass by each of the characters for their lines. So we'll place Jonathan here. As soon as we're past Jonathan, Jeremy has a fairly long line, so we'll have him start here, checking a control panel, and then rush over to the center console as he talks. By combining this into one long move, we'll pass by each of the characters at just the right time. We start here as the captain enters, and pull with her over to Jonathan. By keeping on tracking, we pick up on Jeremy and walk with him over here. The middle keyframes are merely for remembering that our purpose is to pass by Jonathan, and then Jeremy, so we're only placing stop marks at the start and end. Jonathan is sitting down, but Jeremy is standing up, so we need to work on the camera's elevation. In the beginning, the shot is wide enough that it doesn't matter how high or low we are, so we'll start low, ready for Jonathan. As we pick up on Jeremy, we're still low, but then boom up for the ending keyframe, which would have to be at eye level. Let's also bring more action to the beginning by adding a lead-in where we start on some crew members. We'll have them walk past the door, pan with them, and hand off as the door opens, after which we start tracking with the captain. Next, we have some quick dialogue going between the captain and John. With the captain having ended up here, we'll put John by this control panel, which makes it possible to do some shifts or handoffs between them. We'll do this with a stationary camera placed here. Returning quickly to the script, the dialogue goes from the captain to John. Then the ship shakes, and the dialogue again goes from the captain to John. So we'll start the camera on the captain and shift to John. The ship shakes. For the captain's second line, we'll have her step forward as we pan back on her, which will be a step-in handoff. While she talks, we'll have her walk past John and hand off to him for his line. This series of moves will be easy to do, but the question is how to write it down. It would be nearly impossible to write anything by the camera that would make sense later, so let's instead write the camera action out by the characters. Starting by the captain, our first move is to shift over to John. Our second move is to pan back on the captain as she steps forward. Our third move is to hand off back to John. Next, we'll look at what happens to Ishida. She starts with the captain outside the door. By now, this area is getting crowded, so let's have her walk around to this area. Ishida has pulled off some technical magic to make the attacking ships visible, so for her line, we'll have her go from this terminal to this terminal as she lays in the programming. After that, the captain says, "Do it." It would first of all work well to converge with her as she moves from terminal to tense up the shot. But since the dialogue goes from her to the captain, we could also pivot reveal the captain at the end for a smooth transition. The move then starts here. As she walks to the other terminal, we converge. We continue moving, which will give us massive parallax in the background until we pivot reveal the captain behind her as she says, "Do it." After that, Ashita presses a button, so we'll shift down to the control panel, combining a lot of action into a single move. For the attacking ships flaring up on the view screen, we'll need to place an insert. As we end on Ashita and the captain, the line is here. And the next dialogue is over by Jeremy, which forces the insert in this area. To get as wide as possible, let's back out over the first line, which will come across as a pivot on Ashita. For the last 3 rapid-fire lines, let's keep the converging action going. The opening track ended on Jeremy, so we already have an angle on him. But that track is angled the wrong way for converging on Jeremy and the captain, so let's do the ending as a separate shot. Starting the track here, Jeremy has a line, followed by John in the background. The captain steps forwards and we converge on her as she says, "Fire." Let's also converge vertically, bringing us closer and closer to the eye line and making the ending more intense. Let's look at the takes. Because of the long transitions, we have very few cameras. The scene is also very sequential, and the cameras literally take over from each other, so by shooting them in order, we can iron out any wrinkles as we move along. We'll shoot the insert on the view screen last, since the view screen itself is a wild wall we need out for the first 5 cameras. So starting with the first track, as soon as we took the liberty to arrange the characters by their order in the script, the move became very easy to do. We start on the lead-in with the extras, then hand off to the captain and Ashita coming out of the door. We pull past Jonathan for his line, pick up on Jeremy, and boom up as we converge up here. Jeremy's only remaining line is covered in the converge at the end, so we'll cut here. For focus, we'll simply rack back and forth as each character becomes important.
Status.
We can't see a thing. The shots are coming from empty space. There could be more than one ship.
We lost latitude controls at the first hit and the shields are crumbling. We're sitting ducks, sir.
Let's get some general camera shake for the weapons impact in the middle of the scene. We can also do camera shake in post, as we'll do in the cut, but doing it live allows the characters to react to it. The lock camera that hands off between the captain and John is a little difficult to write down, but very easy to execute. We start on the captain, then shift to John. At this point, we know for a fact that we're cutting away to the camera shake on Jeremy, so we could break up the shot here. As we continue, we do a step and handoff back to the captain. As she walks and talks, we do an end-on handoff back on John. Racking focus between them will add nicely to the attention shifts that are already happening.
Any other ships nearby?
All comm energy is being absorbed by the blackout.
John, prepare full spectrum neutron shells. All bays on my mark.
But, sir, we've got nothing to aim for.
For the pivot reveal track on Ashita, we want to be sure the dolly is rolling before her dialogue because we want to cut into the move. We do a diagonal converge to the other monitor. The pivot begins, revealing the captain for her line, and tilt down as Ashita executes the order. The main focus shift will be from Ashita over on the captain as she says "do it," and for everything else we'll just follow focus.
I've reconfigured the forward grid to emit a stream of axion particles. By these readings, it should light up their shields.
Do it.
Here we skip the view screen and do the converge at the end. Jeremy has a line, then John, ending by converging on the captain for her final order.
There they are.
Locked and ready.
Fire!
Finally, the view screen is a completely lock shot with no pan or tilt, so here we'll bring in the wild wall. It's always easiest to corner pin graphics in a completely locked camera. But since Ashita is overlapping the view screen, we depend on the screen being keyable. Otherwise, we need to move her more to the right. Let's view the cut.
Status.
We can't see a thing. The shots are coming from empty space. There could be more than one ship.
We lost latitude controls at the first hit and the shields are crumbling. We're sitting ducks, sir.
Any other ships nearby?
All comm energy is being absorbed by the blackout.
John, prepare full spectrum neutron shells. All bays on my mark.
But, sir, we've got nothing to aim for.
I've reconfigured the forward grid to emit a stream of axion particles. By these readings, it should light up their shields.
Do it.
There they are.
Locked and ready.
Fire!
This scene takes place in a hospital. The backstory is that there have been over 15 mysterious patient deaths from infections, and all doctors have been quarantined and tested, but are now gradually being let back in. At this point in the story, it's clear that the people upstairs are looking for a scapegoat to blame the whole thing on, but we're also beginning to get the feeling that there's some sort of cover-up in progress. Henry, the blue man, is a little on the edge because he privately suspects that he might have caused one of the deaths, but knows for a fact that he couldn't have caused more. However, he's increasingly getting the feeling that someone is trying to frame him, and is very jumpy since he passed testing and is for now not a suspect. Let's do a read-through. Henry, dressed in scrubs, walks past the station guard into the ICU and approaches Solomon, who is preparing some instruments.
Sol, they refused me at the door. You know, I was told to be here this morning and...
Who refused you?
Hoskin and Slater.
Sorry, Henry. You know that Slater has the final word.
But why? I passed all the tests. It's preposterous at this point to assume I pose any danger.
We can't take any chances, Henry.
I didn't cause it, Sol.
You've got to understand that this is a routine investigation. It's not about you personally.
Then why am I not in there operating right now?
Nobody suspects you, Henry.
Henry spies Taylor giving some fluid medication to a patient and storms over.
What did you just do?
What?
That's my patient, nurse. You better have a damn good reason for what you just did.
I was taking the patient's pulse.
No, you were giving her something.
Just her vitamins.
Tell me what you gave her.
Nothing. Just the vitamins.
Don't you dare lie to me. I saw the whole thing.
Solomon enters.
What is going on in here?
Nothing, Dr. Solomon.
I caught her giving something to my patient.
Only vitamins, Dr. Solomon. Just the daily routine.
Give me the bottle.
Taylor gives him the bottle.
Aha, no label.
Henry races over to a pile of medical paperwork and digs through it, looking for the label.
Henry.
Henry finds a vitamin label. He gets up and slowly moves a couple of steps backwards.
I'm sorry, I thought... Sorry, nurse, will you please excuse me?
Henry turns around and leaves, embarrassed. The set we have to work with for this scene has two major areas. First, the area out here, which is where Solomon and Henry have the first half of the dialogue. And secondly, the enclosed area in here, where Henry rushes in and accuses the nurse Taylor. The enclosed area has windows that we have the option of shooting through, which can be helpful given the small size of that room. However, this entire wall is wild, and taking it out for some shots will give us more freedom to pick angles. This is a fairly small location, so it would be a good idea to do everything we can to maximize our use of depth. One way to do that would be to use wide-angle lenses. However, this is a tent scene, and we would create a more concentrated atmosphere with long lenses. So to get the feeling of depth, let's instead make it a goal to do as many deliberate deep staging shots as possible. Using a shallow depth of field and racking focus will also create more separation between depths. And we'll also try to shoot across as much space as possible, like shooting the enclosed area from out here. Shooting characters here with a door and hallway in the background, or shooting characters here with the outer room and hallway in the background. One particular deep staging shot that comes to mind is that for the first half of the scene, the nurse Taylor is tending to the patient, which is what Henry suddenly reacts to. If we place Solomon here, Henry here, and a camera here, we have an over-the-shoulder with her in the background before she's needed. So let's use that as an anchor and build the first half of the scene around it, starting with a matching reverse here. In the beginning, Henry rushes in from the hallway, past the guard and over to Solomon. Solomon's role is very indifferent, so let's have him stand at a right angle working with instruments and occasionally turn to Henry. Henry, on the other hand, would need some agitated movement, so let's create another stop he can walk to and from at least once. To cover that, we could pivot this camera to maintain an over-the-shoulder, and add a matching locked reverse over here. With a line moving between these two positions, we'll only be able to cut to this camera when the line has crossed it. And because this is not the main position for Henry, this will be a fairly short take. We also have some deep staging opportunities shooting towards the door. In the second pivot position, we automatically get the guard outside the door in the background in a staggered shot similar to the shot with Taylor in the background. In the first pivot position, we could do the same by adding another guard, which we're essentially just doing because we can. For covering Henry's entry, right now the first stop for the pivoting camera is here, set up for when he has arrived. We're actually better off starting in the second pivot position, and then pivot with him into the scene. But let's keep working backwards by adding a lead-in that gives us a moment to focus on Solomon before Henry walks in. If we start with Solomon here, and the camera framed away from the starting position, he can be working with some instruments as the script suggests. And then step to his first reel mark as we pan with him into the main keyframe, which will make it seem more like we just happened to catch Henry coming through the door. Let's actually add another lead-in to that. In Solomon's new starting position, we'll add some nurses and a control panel in the background. If he then starts outside the frame, we get some general ambience first. We get an attention shift as he steps in. Pan with him to the right just as Henry enters. Then pivot into the scene. Pivot again as he walks to his arbitrary stop. And back again, so that's 4 stops on this track so far. With that down, Henry sees Taylor giving something to the patient, which would make sense to get from this camera and rack focus as well. He then walks in, which would be most obvious to cover by extending the track much further, ending up in and over the shoulder through the window. We'll have to keep the track angle from the pivot because that section is so precisely adjusted that we better leave it, and moving slightly wider probably won't matter. Naturally, this move has more punch if we get some foreground. In the beginning, Solomon provides parallax like any object in a keyframe. After that, let's put in an IV. Then there's a wall. And on the table inside the first window, we'll place some microscopes. Between the windows, there's again a wall, and after that, we'll again put in various medical equipment. We'll place the last foreground in the left and right of the ending keyframes, so we're shooting through the gap in the middle. But let's look for a moment at shooting through the windows. In the angle we've picked, we'll basically be shooting our own reflection, and it would be hard to angle the shot enough that we can't see ourselves. One solution would be to simply lower the reflection either by lowering the overall light on our side or by using polarizers. But a foreground reflection will look great for this shot, and because it's the frontmost layer, it's actually so easy to add in post that it can often be done in the editing system. We'll then simply shoot it with square holes instead of windows and superimpose an image for a reflection, which will allow us to shoot directly through the windows. We would merely need to move the image slightly for parallax and mask out the parts that are supposed to be a wall. Inside the enclosed room, we have a stretch of dialogue between Henry and Taylor. There's basically no stage direction for this part, but it would diminish Henry's character to simply stand still at this point. So let's create some agitated movement of him walking over to the desk looking for something. And then over to Taylor as he wants to see the bottle. In the middle of this, Solomon enters to ask what's going on. And if we time Henry's first move to that, it would be very easy to hand off whichever camera covers Henry's walk over on Solomon. Besides that, let's do some pretty regular keyframe-based coverage and then expand on it with lead-ins and extensions. For the first half, we'll start with a couple of external reverses, which we're putting further back to use longer lenses for a tighter atmosphere. Although we'll probably shoot Taylor's cameras if it's from inside the room. We can do that without removing the wild wall because we're shooting the windows without glass and we'll do the reflections in post. When Henry has walked around to the table, let's put in a keyframe here, creating a shot with Taylor in the foreground. For their consecutive dialogue with Solomon, this will create a great opportunity for staying in the same shot and racking focus between them. When Henry walks over to Taylor, let's create a wider keyframe. These two last keyframes really both cover the same business, so let's go ahead and connect them into a track that simply opens a space as Henry walks over. In the first half, covered in the two external reverses, the dialogue is fairly intense and it might get a little static to be locked, so let's look for some ways to do slow pushes. This is easily done in Henry's camera, but the problem with doing this in Taylor's camera is that the other angle we have on her, which is the long track that's still rolling, can't push. Cutting between two cameras from the same angle with only one of them pushing could get a little odd. So let's just push Henry's camera, which could work because he's the most intense character. However, that also means that we're cutting between two reverses where only one of them is pushing, which could also get odd. We really have to both shoot it and cut it to find out if it works, so let's get a lock version of Henry's camera as well. With these cameras down, let's pick which camera does the handoff to Solomon. At the end of Henry's walk to the table, both his and Taylor's dialogue is with Solomon. And if we've handed off Henry's camera, we'll not only end up on the wrong side of both lines, Henry would also obscure Solomon and would ultimately need to walk through the camera as well. So let's do the handoff from the over-the-shoulder on Taylor. We then simply stay locked for the static part of the dialogue, pan with Henry as he walks, and continue panning to reveal Solomon stepping in. Solomon's line is very short, and the next shot is almost certainly this one. So let's lead in this shot by starting pan in this direction, pick up on Henry and pan into the shot with Taylor in the foreground for her line, which follows next. Here we then rack focus back and forth. And as Henry walks over, we open the space. As he asks to see the bottle, let's extend the ending keyframe by shifting down on the bottle. The next thing that happens is that Henry walks somewhere else to look for a label. If we make that place over here, we can simply track this camera, which is now quickly becoming an occasional master. Immediately after, Solomon has a line. And instead of adding new cameras for that, let's simply have him step into the background of Henry's shot, which he will then complete. As Henry looks through the papers and labels, let's again shift down. And slowly up again as he realizes that Taylor was telling the truth. The last thing that happens is that Henry stands for a bit, then walks out embarrassed. Here it would make sense with a close push on Solomon and Taylor as they stand puzzled. But all we really need is some sort of move to give it more meaning, so let's be lazy and simply track the occasional master more to the right. And have Solomon step over here to look after Henry exiting. Let's also have Taylor step into the background of that shot looking after Henry. Let's look at the takes. Except for the camera that began as a pivot and became a long master with 7 stops, this blocking is pretty straightforward. Most shots have the same flexibility in setting marks as in any other scene, except the deep staging shots in the first half, which all need to be framed extremely precisely. The most important shot here, which we use as an anchor to find all other marks from, is the over-the-shoulder with Taylor in the background. With the same character positions, the matching reverse needs to get this guard in the background. So we'll need to go back and forth a couple of times until we find some character and camera positions that can do both. For Henry's second mark, we wanted to get the other guard in the background of the pivot camera, but this is a little easier because his mark is arbitrary and we can just place it wherever the framing ends up right. The reverse for this angle is not a deep shot and doesn't need to be placed that carefully, so we'll simply make it match the size and composition of wherever the tracking shot lands. Prior to Henry entering, we did the lead-in on Solomon to identify for a moment with him and to make the reveal of Henry more casual. With the track in the starting position, this was simply a keyframe away from the main action, with Solomon in the foreground and the nurses in the background. And the lead into that started with Solomon outside the frame. So starting on the nurses, Solomon steps into the foreground and we rack focus. He walks over to his first real mark, casually revealing Henry entering, and we pivot into the second camera stop. As Henry walks to his arbitrary mark, we pivot to the third stop, which is the same as we started in. And back again after a bit of dialogue. This would be a good time to break up the shot because the remaining action belongs to the other half of the scene. So starting a new take, Henry walks into the enclosed room, first behind Solomon, then the IV, the wall, the foreground inside the room, ending over here between the two pieces of foreground. Here we sit locked for a while, and we might actually cut again because the next thing that happens is after Henry has taken the bottle from Taylor and walks over to the window. Here we'll find when shooting that the framing isn't exactly right, and we'll need to reframe, which is also easier to do if we cut. Starting again, we track with Henry over to the counter, and Solomon steps in and completes the framing. We shift down, then up again, and Henry leaves, after which we track as far to the right as we can get, while Taylor steps over and completes that framing.
Saul, they refused me at the door. You know, I was told to be here this morning and...
Who refused you?
Hoskin and Slater.
Sorry, Henry, you know that Slater has the final word.
But why? I passed all the tests. It's preposterous at this point to assume I pose any danger.
We can't take any chances, Henry.
I didn't cause it, Saul.
You've got to understand that this is a routine investigation. It's not about you personally.
Then why am I not in there operating right now?
Nobody suspects you, Henry.
What did you just do?
What?
That's my patient, nurse. You better have a damn good reason for what you just did.
I was taking the patient's pulse.
No, you were giving her something.
Just her vitamins.
Tell me what you gave her.
Nothing. Just the vitamins.
Don't you dare lie to me. I saw the whole thing.
What is going on in here?
Nothing, Dr. Solomon.
I caught her giving something to my patient.
Only vitamins, Dr. Solomon. Just the daily routine.
Give me the bottle. Aha, no label.
Henry.
I'm sorry, I thought... Sorry, nurse, will you please excuse me?
Back at the beginning, let's quickly look at the two matching reverses. The first one was the anchor with Taylor in the background. We'll keep focus on Solomon, but rack focus to Taylor while Solomon does his last line. The dialogue is the same as before, and you may want to fast forward after a while.
Saul, they refused me at the door. You know, I was told to be here this morning and...
Who refused you?
Hoskin and Slater.
Sorry, Henry, you know that Slater has the final word.
But why? I passed all the tests. It's preposterous at this point to assume I pose any danger.
We can't take any chances, Henry.
I didn't cause it, Saul.
You've got to understand that this is a routine investigation. It's not about you personally.
Then why am I not in there operating right now?
Nobody suspects you, Henry.
What did you just do?
The other lock reverse is just to fill in while the line is on the second stop, so this is a very short take. To create more depth, let's decorate the background with some consoles.
Sorry, Henry, you know that Slater has the final word.
But why? I passed all the tests. It's preposterous at this point to assume I pose any danger.
We can't take any chances, Henry.
I didn't cause it, Saul.
You've got to understand that this is a routine investigation. It's not about you personally.
Over in the second half of the scene, the next camera is the over-the-shoulder on Taylor. This camera simply stays locked for the main part and pans with Henry as he walks around to the table, handing off to Solomon.
What did you just do?
What?
That's my patient, nurse. You better have a damn good reason for what you just did.
I was taking the patient's pulse.
No, you were giving her something.
Just her vitamins.
Tell me what you gave her.
Nothing. Just the vitamins.
Don't you dare lie to me. I saw the whole thing.
What is going on in here?
Nothing, Dr. Solomon.
I caught her giving something to my patient.
The over-the-shoulder on Henry is simply a slow push for the duration of his dialogue here. For this shot, we'll want some real glass in the windows because adding reflections in the background would be much more difficult than it was in the foreground. For this angle, we plan to do a lock take as well, but let's skip that and only do the push. However, let's do a slow one in case it doesn't work so well.
What did you just do?
What?
That's my patient, nurse. You better have a damn good reason for what you just did.
I was taking the patient's pulse.
No, you were giving her something.
Just her vitamins.
Tell me what you gave her.
Nothing. Just the vitamins.
Don't you dare lie to me. I saw the whole thing.
What is going on in here?
The last camera is the closer shot on Taylor with Henry in the background. We're doing this one last because we need to get the wild wall out. This camera starts away from the main keyframe, picks up on Henry, pans into the deep stop where it racks focus between them for their lines. When Henry walks over, we open the space, and then shift down on the bottle.
What is going on in here?
Nothing, Dr. Solomon.
I caught her giving something to my patient.
Only vitamins, Dr. Solomon. Just the daily routine.
Give me the bottle. Aha, no label.
Let's view the cut.
Dr. Statement, please. Michael Crawford, 340. Michael Crawford, please call 340.
Saul, they refused me at the door. You know, I was told to be here this morning and...
Who refused you?
Hoskin and Slater.
Sorry, Henry. You know that Slater has the final word.
But why? I passed all the tests. It's preposterous at this point to assume I pose any danger.
We can't take any chances, Henry.
I didn't cause it, Saul.
You've got to understand that this is a routine investigation. It's not about you personally.
Then why am I not in there operating right now?
Nobody suspects you, Henry.
What did you just do?
What?
That's my patient, nurse. You better have a damn good reason for what you just did.
I was taking the patient's pulse.
No, you were giving her something.
Just her vitamins.
Tell me what you gave her.
Nothing. Just the vitamins.
Don't you dare lie to me. I saw the whole thing.
What is going on in here?
Nothing, Dr. Solomon.
I caught her giving something to my patient.
Only vitamins, Dr. Solomon. Just the daily routine.
Give me the bottle. Aha, no label.
Henry.
I'm sorry, I thought... Sorry, nurse, will you please excuse me?
Dr. Forrest, dial 118, please. Dr. Forrest, please dial 118.